afternoon and welcome to the Humanities Festival for those who just came. My name is DESSY GAVRILOVA, and in the next 1 hour I'll be steering the conversation with our dear guest, Albena Azmanova, and we'll be talking about 21st century capitalism and its discontent. It will be a conversation between two of us for only about 40 minutes, not more than that, and then I'm going to leave the rest 20 minutes for your comments and questions to Albena. But let me first very briefly present our dear guest today. Albena Azmanova is a political scientist and historian of ideas. She has been teaching for many, many years at the Kent University Brussels School of International Studies. And in her work, she applies political and social theory, the history of ideas, political sociology, comparative politics, economics, psychology even, in order to analyze phenomena like the collapse of dictatorships, the democratic transition, the erosion of rule of law, the rise of late 20th century populism, and most lately 21st century capitalism. And what I find really interesting, you might tell me whether I'm right, but I see there always a very important, I find, link between your personal experience and your intellectual endeavor and pursuits. Because, of course, it's someone coming from Bulgaria, as I do, by the way. Albena has lived in 1989 through the collapse of the communist regimes. She has observed from a close distance the democratic transition, which was far from perfect. The rule of law and the erosion and the lack of it is something that remains a problem in our country, but in many other countries. So I find that exactly in this field between personal experience and intellectual pursuit is where the originality of her ideas come up. Albena has published several books and volumes, edited volumes, of which I just want to mention The Scandal of Reason, A Critical Theory of Political Judgment, and the most recent one, Capitalism on the Edge, about which we're going to talk in more detail just now. And last but not least, Albena has been serving as a political advisor and policy advisor to a number of institutions like the United Nations, Council of Europe, European Parliament, European Commission. Very well welcome, Albena.
Thank you, DESSY. Thank you.
So, in your most recent book, you take the intellectual journey of analyzing the changing nature of work in the 21st century and the resulting shifts in power relations in our society. And you come with something that I find a very original idea or a lens through which we can see where actually the problem with global 21st century capitalism lies. And what you're saying is that contrary to what most people believe, that it is inequality where the problem lies, you find that it's rather precarity. So I would like to start this conversation by asking you to elaborate on your ideas.
Okay, thank you, DESSY, and it's such a joy to be here, and thank you for coming for this conversation, hopefully together. So my take on contemporary capitalism actually was kind of triggered, my unusual take was triggered by a specific question asked by a political force, the left parties in the European Parliament 20 years ago. So you mentioned this, my connection to practical politics, yeah, that feeds my insight. And so these political parties, it was 2003, they asked me, how is it possible that we're losing the vote of the working people to the far right, to the rising at the time, there was increasing votes to the far right, although these were conditions of good employment, growth, etc. It was before the financial crisis. So I started looking into that. And, maybe actually growing up under communism and joining the dissident movement has helped me stay away from dogma, being political but staying away from, the dogmatic truths of the day. I came to the conclusion that although the left was talking increasingly about growing inequality. And then after the financial crisis of 2008, increasingly about the crisis of capitalism, it was not working because they were overlooking what I have come to call a pandemic of precarity. And let me just quickly explain that when I talk about precarity, I do not mean uncertainty. Now, there's a lot of talk about uncertainty. Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, just gave a brilliant talk saying that the three evils that are making our situation unsustainable are inequality, impunity, and uncertainty. But when we're criticizing the world for being uncertain, we risk to idolize, to endorse the value of certainty. And for people who grew up under a dictatorship like we did, we remember that this imposed certainty. We knew where we will be working, where we will be living, where we will go on vacation. We actually rebelled against that certainty. We wanted freedom. So we need to be careful what we are endorsing when we criticize something, or we implicitly endorse. Like when we criticize inequality and by default endorse equality. Even Marx was saying that this is not the value to endorse, but solidarity, right? So anyway, to explain the difference, why my idea about this generalized precarity or ubiquitous precarity, that it is not the same as uncertainty, it is a very special insecurity. And that is why I use the not very nice term precarity. By the way, in the English language, until recently, such a word did not exist in the dictionaries. It's only there, well, the normal word is precariousness. So we're using this new word indicating that there is something new going on. So let me tell you about how I understand precarity in my very peculiar take on it. So it is an insecurity that is rooted in the insecurity of livelihoods and lives. But mostly, I'm concerned with the economic roots of that insecurity. So when are we precarious is when we not simply have a poorly paid and insecure job. Of course, the precarious class, we all know, this is very visible. But we are also precarious when we are tasked with duties that we cannot perform, either because there is no time, resources, or skills. So we feel disempowered to perform what we have to do in order to survive, in order to keep our job. So we experience precarity with this incapacity to cope because we are not equipped to cope. And in that sense, so think of it, young people who can never get a job, so long-term unemployed, they cannot enter the labor market, they cannot even get a source of livelihood, they're precarious. People who work non-stop on stable, well-paid jobs, but they are pressured with so many responsibilities that actually they cannot take a holiday, they suffer from mental health. They're also precarious. An example would be the nurses and doctors in the British healthcare system. Curious statistics I saw last year, over 50% of them are considering quitting their job because simply they cannot cope. If you think you cannot cope, you do not have a stable employment. All right, so this is the ubiquitous precarity. And the second feature that makes it a special type of insecurity is that it is politically generated. It is not just the general uncertainty and insecurity of modern life, no. These things are a result of specific politics, ideological attitudes, and policies. And so in my work in this book, it was translated It was translated in German, in French, now in Italian, and it came out 4 years ago in English. So I traced carefully the logic of the political production of insecurity. But the short story is that as our governments have become made competitiveness in the global economy the top policy priority, they're slashing budgets for public spending, they're making our employment insecure, and they're pushing more and more responsibilities down to citizens. So public authority is washing its hands from taking care of us and of society, and is hand-picking specific economic players like big companies. Now this is the big new idea of the European Commission to build national champions. So they're alleviating the competitive pressures on the big economic actors, on the strong ones, and then all the competitive pressures are pushed down on society. So this is my idea of the general precarization that is afflicting, that is kind of contaminating everybody. Those, high education with PhD degrees and without degrees, men, women, young, old. I speak about the precarity of the 99%.
But you mentioned that precarity is a new word, but how new is the phenomena? Can you assign a birth date, more or less, of this phenomena?
Well, of course, modern societies are insecure, but I use this term to speak about those policies that deliberately created this situation. And I date them towards somewhere the turn of the 21st century, when competitiveness started to trump everything else. One example is pandemic. So what does the pandemic, the COVID pandemic has to do with precarity? Well, the policies that made a public health emergency into an economic crisis follows something like that. In 2017, I believe, the European Commission proposed the development of vaccines against a virus like COVID, because it was not unknown. People knew that such a danger existed, and they made a proposal within a public-private initiative called Innovative Medicine Initiative. So the European Commission, which is a public power, together with the big pharmaceutical companies. What did these companies say to the proposal? No thanks, because this is not going to sell. This is not competitive in the global markets. So a very necessary policy was killed because it was measured with the gauge of how competitive that would make our economy. So these kind of decisions I date, these are the culprit. And also, so an element of precarity is the fear or the anticipation of losing your social status. So Western societies feel very precarious because we are all quite well-to-do, and we are rapidly experiencing this threat for social slipping. And for me, this a lot explains why the vote of the disillusioned and the threatened and the scared people is going to the right rather than the left.
We'll come to talk about this later. But in your book, you get to criticize the leftist criticism of capitalism for two reasons. You say it's wrongly directed and it's not radical enough. Yes. And you're talking about the paradox of emancipation, I think you call it, where that even you're saying in the most radical fights for justice and redistribution, actually the left or the critics of capitalism are keeping the stage in capitalism in a sort of a zombie state. They're reaffirming it. And you quote the indignados who say we're not against the system, but the system is against us, which is sort of a plea for inclusion rather than for dismantling the system. So my question is, what, in your opinion, and following your logic, would be the adequate leftist agenda?
Right. You brought up the emancipation paradox. So let me just unpack this. The left has been increasingly louder. Oh, you can't hear me? The left has been focused on inequality. I mean, of course, it triggers our sense of injustice. The global 1% of the rich possess 43% of the global wealth. This doesn't seem fair. But if we think about this concern with being equal within an otherwise unjust system, so to be included and equal within an unjust system, what does that mean? That we actually value that system. And all we need to do is to fight for our place within it. In that sense, this is not a radical position. So within that logic, we have arrived at groups fighting for victimhood, what I like to call victimhood Olympics, because in conditions of precarity, where claiming the status of a victim is about the only source of kind of social protection you can have, of course you have to play that card, otherwise you are doomed. But on that plane, one group of victims is fighting another group of victims while the perpetrators are going, invisible. So what is the alternative, you ask me for that?
What is the leftist agenda was the question.
Yeah, well,
leftist activists, what is the adequate leftist
the adequate,
position?
what is the solution in a way for that? It is first of all to accept this diagnosis that is general precarity rather than going with the fashionable dogmas of the day that we have inherited. Maybe they were useful at some point. And then search for a solution that is coming directly from this diagnosis. I will steal a phrase from one of my favorite East European authors, Stanislav Lec, a Polish writer, used to say, the exit is usually the same place where the entry was, the entrance was. So if the entrance into this trouble is the policies that create precarity, let's fight those policies. Let's fight the fact that considerations of profit or the profit motive have trumped all other considerations. I mean, we are running our universities for profit, not for knowledge. A lot of actually the bans on protest in universities is done under considerations that we need to attract international students, and this doesn't look good for profit making. So that would be a more specific, The left has been, as the right, the center left and the center right also, very populist in promising inclusive prosperity for all. We should stop with that promise. We cannot continue with producing and redistributing prosperity when we have to take care of the environment. So, but you have to offer something to people. What I'm proposing is that we offer economic stability, security of the sources of income and livelihood, so that people can project their lives, see the future without anxiety. Because no matter how rich you make people, but if their wealth is insecure, they will be haunted by all of these anxieties and nastiness that comes from precarity.
But how can capitalism be reformed? Yesterday we were listening from Kotkin saying that actually dismantling capitalism is not something that wins the elections, because you have actually to vote for giving away your wealth, etc. Yes. So how could this happen?
Okay, what to do with capitalism? I like to talk about subverting it rather than overcoming it, by diminishing the role that the considerations of profit play. Because actually they're hurting also the winners. COVID, again, is a big example. For me, it happened as a pandemic, as a global socio-economic crisis, because our policies prioritize profit, and that obviously was not good for the rich either. Now, it's important, though, to drop all talk about the crisis of capitalism. The left loves that thing, but it is playing in the hands of the right, because for that narrative implies also that capitalism, as supposedly the engine of prosperity, is in need of being saved. So that really plays in the hands of reactionary forces. And also it invites emergency policies that prevents us from looking ahead. It's a permanent crisis management. So this becomes part of the solution of the problem we're trying to solve. So we don't need, to wage a battle directly with those words against, for the fall down of overthrow of capitalism. I don't think it's going to work. But we could attack, that extreme focus on profit, which, capitalism is not just market economy. Capitalism is a social system, and here I'm following no other than Marx, that is motivated by the pursuit of profit, what Marx called the profit motive. Even without using the term capitalism, you fight the profit motive and you fight capitalism.
But if capitalism doesn't need to be saved, and if we think like this is a trap, so how would exactly the alternative look like? You and I lived through an alternative, one alternative, which we know how it ended in '89. Is something like a basic unconditional income way to a solution? Or how does post-capitalism look like, in your opinion?
Okay, I personally am averse to utopias. I think that, or grand ideals, because I think they're always getting us in trouble and we don't need them. We lived through a society that justified a lot of bad things through this commitment to the grand idea. And I would there go always with Václav Havel, who believed that socialism and capitalism are just two forms of a very toxic form of modernity, and they're not true alternatives. So for me, it would be not necessary to have a blueprint, but to practically focus on what is hurting people. And for me, what is hurting us is this increased commitment on competitiveness in the global economy. The European Commission has completely made that its flagship policy now. So let us start the fight today against the specific things, and then we'll see where that leads us. I don't think we need to know the end result.
In your work, you have been paying attention and looking into deliberative democracy a lot, amongst others in your book, The Scandal of Reason. But I was wondering, what do you think of this Habermasian idea that deliberation is the way to solve social conflict? And what is happening with this idea in a situation where a whole generation are raised on social media, where they rather stay with like-minded people in their opinion bubbles, and this place of confrontation with the other side and deliberation is, it seems to me, kind of becoming smaller and smaller. What is left from this idea?
Right. So the idea of direct democracy, forms of direct engagement, they became fashionable, 30 years ago, and they're also very fashionable now because we see that the institutions of electoral politics are not giving good results. But I'm very skeptical about two things in the, both deliberative democracy. I do not believe that we can solve the crisis of democracy with more democracy. Because when our political economy produces scared and hateful democrats, all channels of democratic representation would translate that into policy. This is exactly what's happening with the rise of the far right. They're coming through the channels of democratic, free and fair elections. However, there are forms of democratic engagement that could help this, to end, for instance, the victimhood Olympics. And I have seen that happen in deliberative fora that are produced in a very specific way, for instance, through random sampling, so that we make sure that, very poor and precarious people confront also the frustrated, business people who are angry that their taxes are being wasted. So when such people, exactly, to step out of the silos, are made to talk to each other, there is a chance that they direct their attention not against each other, but against their common sources of frustration and suffering, and to attribute responsibility to the public authorities that are not doing their job to create, a fair economy for all. So I just came from such a forum yesterday. We're trying to establish, with my colleague and friend Calypso Nicolaidis, a People's Assembly for Europe, and that experiment, it's an experimental entity. We just opened it yesterday in Athens. So why this is different, why this is good, is because when we vote, we vote alone. So we succumb to these fears and anxieties. But when we are, for instance, in social movements or in this kind of assemblies, we're not alone. So we feel less precarious. And by true confrontation, and so what my other, I'm reminded what you asked me, because this ideal, Habermasian ideal of deliberative democracy is very much based on the belief that when citizens treat each other as rational, equal and free individuals, by talking, they're going to resolve their problems. Well, no, we really need a true confrontation where, without even much of any restraint, people can fight, people can confront each other and create this critical engagement with each other's lives. So I don't have much patience with wishful thinking that is so much in normative philosophy. So as an ideal, yeah, a good ideal, but it doesn't help.
But tell me more about what you just mentioned, this assembly, European People's Assembly, you said?
European People's Assembly, People's Assembly for Europe. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so tell us more about it. How does it look, so that we see whether it's a plausible kind of thing or mechanism that can be used? Because on the first reading, I'm a little bit skeptical, I have to admit, because I can imagine that every city, every town should have something like this in order that this has any impact on democracies as a whole. So when you have something like this in Athens, how far it can bring you?
Well, okay, this idea arose within a network we call the European Odyssey. We're looking for alternative ways, first to make political elites accountable, because of this disconnect. I personally believe that accountability is the key thing to look for. And it's also very important that these new deliberative forums that connect strangers together, make them discuss common problems, are not overburdened with things that democracy, that they actually cannot deliver. For instance, they cannot make binding decisions because they're not equipped, to make binding decisions. But they have their input into the process. So I'm very skeptical of burdening democracy with doing the work of political elites. So yeah, I would be skeptical there.
Yeah. At this point, I would like to turn to you. If there are already questions, please show me sign. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Please, the microphones. Here, first row, and then there.
Thank you. So, Albena, I promised you to ask a silly question, so there I go. You know, I was just wondering, to what an extent your notion of precarity, that I think is very interesting, and I think I feel very convinced that, you know, what you say gets to the heart of the problem. To what an extent is the notion of precarity part of capitalism in general, you know, on the one hand? I'm thinking, for example, was it in the 1970s or 80s, someone who came to report to the American Congress, and they asked him, how is the American economy going? And he said, it's going super well, thanks to worker uncertainty. And I think he meant precarity. So to what an extent is precarity part of the capitalist system in general? To what an extent what you're describing, these policies at the turn of the 21st century, are a new phenomenon, and probably capitalism itself has changed, and it's no longer capitalism in the way we understand it in a classical sense of the word. You know, for example, what you're describing about competitiveness being pushed down. So basically, you don't have real competitiveness when it comes to the level of Amazon. Who is Amazon competing with? So what sort of capitalism is that? So I wonder whether it's precarity is a condition of capitalism, or precarity is a condition of capitalism that has transformed into something else. So there.
Okay, well,
That's my
not a silly question at all. To what extent precarity? Yes, so the logic of capitalism based on competition, not just competitiveness, but competition. Because currently what we have is making some competitive in the global economy by repressing competition for them. So capitalism is based on agents competing for profit, that's it. But the goal is always to kill the competition. So the end of competition is the implicit goal of those who compete. Yeah? When you win, that's... so that, yeah, in a way, that there is a moment of always this insecurity there. What will happen to you if you do not compete successfully? As a capitalist, you join the working class. Now, what happened with the welfare state is something very curious. So the welfare state was established there in order to eliminate personal dependencies on communities, churches, on... So it made us dependent. It gave, you know, to cut dependency on the market. So this kind of precariousness of being dependent on the market and being dependent on communities. So we citizens became directly dependent on the state through certain, however, not personally dependent, because welfare, you know, employment insurance, etc., etc. So the goodies of the welfare state were guaranteed. So it was a disconnection, cutting of personal dependencies on the market and on specific groups. Now, when the welfare state started corroding in the 80s, and you know, now in many countries is almost gone, the power of the state apparatus to control our lives is still there, but the welfare that made us independent, both from markets and communities, is gone. So we have become precarious in that sense, that we are dependent on the market, we have nothing else, and we're dependent on these political elites hence the idea with the competition for victimhood, because when you are claim group victimhood, you also claim personal protection by political elite. So it's a patronage. It's linked to a patronage. But these elites, they source their power from bestowing their patronage, their protection. So the left usually protects certain ethnic and racial minorities, the right religious minorities. So the contemporary, back to your question, the precarity of capitalism is very acutely sensed now exactly because this, the welfare state cushion that made us non-dependent on markets and non-dependent on any patronage is gone.
Please, a question there. And there was somewhere there before. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 3, 4.
Me, okay. Please, if you please, what is the matter with social movements? I've had a closer look at Democracy in Europe movement, and what I could tell was that it was morphing into a vessel for people who didn't make it in parties in positions of power, or also many intellectually minded people who mostly enjoy posing questions, their own questions, and answering them. Much less, though, at going to those on the other side of our greatest cultural divide, the unintellectual people, and asking them for their questions. We are much more comfortable staying among our own, obviously. Well, what do you say to this?
What's happening with social movements?
Mm-hmm.
Are we connecting?
No, you can answer it in the next one.
Okay.
Just to prepare.
Look, I think social movements have all kinds of shape and form. We shouldn't idealize them, but we should also not expect them to perform miracles. I'm working closely with the European Civic Forum that gathers a lot of social movements, and well, thank God that they exist. Otherwise, we'll be completely alone, based, closed up in our personal anxieties. So social movements are there to politicize certain matters, to break our sense that certain things are normal, to bring things to public attention, and this is what I consider their role. We cannot burden them with solving the problems that we as citizens need to press public authority to deliver, to solve.
Okay. I have a question regarding the quote you mentioned, that exit is entrance. So could you be a bit more specific about the entrance? And you mentioned the turn of the 21st century, but also answering the previous question, you mentioned the 80s, and this is usually the time that people who are dealing with precarity, like Lauren Berland, they point to 80s and the Reagan and Thatcher and dismantling of welfare state as the beginning of it.
Yes.
So what would you say is this entrance?
Well, the entrance was this rampant opening of our economies to global competition. Exactly that happened in the 1980s and 90s. So I'm only saying we should not return to that. I say we should solve the problems that created. Yeah, thank you for allowing me to make that clear. So I'm not advocating a return to the 80s policies, not at all, on the contrary. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm wondering how much freedom you think the EU, Europe, has to act in a world where we're hemmed in on one side by the US and the other by China, both of whom are committed to different models of precarity. The US with sort of an oligarchy capitalism and entrepreneur fetish, and then China with a state-driven capitalism that also forces its citizens to live in precarity.
Yes.
But both of which are very competitive, and which will not let Europe just sort of go on its own on its.
Yes. So if we emulate the Chinese model, that will be a very autocratic type of capitalism, and the American model is, rampant employment insecurity. Europe, what can Europe do? European Union policies, at some point with the previous administration, there was a very nice package of the European Green Deal, notwithstanding all its flaws, but it was trying to put very high labor and environmental standards into economic policy and demand that actually all the products, for instance, that are imported into the European Union comply with these standards. Now, with the new Commission, it seems that it's set on going against much of that, and I think it will be a big mistake, because Europe is a very important market. These players will comply with our demands if we stick to them. Yeah.
And if there are other questions, yeah, there.
Thank you very much. My question is the following. How different is the idea of precarity from the idea of anxiety?
Of anxiety. Mm-hmm.
Because in a certain way, the welfare state works very well when it was responding to needs. Mm-hmm. If you have a need, if you want to have a television, basically the government can help you have one. But if you have 100 televisions, and basically the major competition between the companies is to try to push you to get the one that you really like, then the government is in a much more difficult situation. And of course, this is, for me, because in a certain way, I do believe you're right. You don't experience social inequality in your everyday life. I don't believe that every day that I'm going to wake up, I'm comparing my incomes with Elon Musk. But this kind of anxiety, in a certain way, goes deeper than simply the income that I have and the task that I'm going. For me, a much more interesting figure of the world today is a shopper who goes to a shop, buy a dress, and 2 days later decides to return it because any choice can be redetermined. Nothing is commitment. In a certain way, what you really moved from is that you have such a broadening of the choices that the anxiety does not come from the fact that basically you have a shrinking choices, but the very broadening of the choice creates this psychological situation in which even if you have certain incomes, even if you have a middle-class life, all the time you are basically asking for something else. And this is not necessarily a profit motive. Mm-hmm. This is our kind of experience of freedom of having unlimited choices. And from this point of view, I don't know to what extent precarious is simply an economic term, and to what extent it's much more cultural and psychological definition of the life that we're living. Sorry for being too long.
Okay, great. I think the kind of precarity I describe, which is based on people fearing that they cannot continue, that they cannot support a dignified life that they perceive, is experienced as anxiety, but I would not include the type of anxiety you described as kind of a feature of that. Of course, with the proliferation of opportunity, every opportunity we do not chase is a failure, and that creates anxiety. But, that is not what I'm concerned, and that is not what I would call precarity. And I think that my children are now young adults, and I see that among their communities, and they are shunning away, from that chasing of all the opportunities of cheap products, etc. So there is a way to deal with that kind of anxiety, but they cannot individually fight the anxiety that comes by knowing that no matter how many master's degrees you accumulate, you would not land a job that would secure a decent life for you.
There's a question there, if you can, no, this microphone,
okay.
If you can go in the middle, okay.
Yeah, can I, yeah, okay.
First and then
Sorry.
second, please, there.
My question is rather to be, on the positive note. So my question is that if you said at the very beginning of this time of precarity, or when the precarity intensified, it was in the 80s, with the globalization. And this idea was, this economic policy was based also on the idea of the global peace, that the Soviet Union is no more, the real danger. China is going to be on our side in the long run, also democratic. So this globalization that leads to precarity also was, in a way, I think, tied together with the peaceful development of the world. And then, on the positive note, would be that if the Fukuyama's dream is now over, and we are facing again, real enemies. So the question would be whether the Western countries has to cooperate much more, not in the bad competitive way that produce precarity. So if the, let's say, precarious international relations that produce, wars and so is helpful in a way that we, who on the West, need to cooperate much more, less in a capitalistic, dirty capitalistic measure, but much more, let's say, without this precarity results. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can have globalization in any shape we want it. Depends on the kind of rules we agree. So we don't have necessarily to connect through competition, but through cooperation. I would just agree with you. Yeah.
Is this on? I think so. Hi. As you know, I'm primarily a linguist, and during this discussion, it occurred to me, do we actually know what precarity is in Mandarin, for instance?
In Mandarin.
Sorry?
I could not hear. In
Mandarin?
Precarities?
I just wonder what effect language has on this whole debate.
Oh. Yeah. I would.
Well, I just find it. Are we agreed on these concepts? Because you can't really discuss to what extent is any given concept precarity or not. To what extent do they influence the debate that we're trying to have?
Look, I use the term purely as a technical term that allows me to address this phenomenon I describe. I would not claim that it has, translatable universal value. It is just helping me address a problem, and that's all I'm prepared to do. Thank you for your question.
There's a question there.
Yes, I'm a Swiss political scientist, and I'm more optimistic than you about deliberation, because we do deliberation for 600 years. In Switzerland, we do direct democratic votes. People feel very much represented in politics. They can vote on average 12 times a year about really important questions. Do we want COVID vaccines or not? We could vote about that. It helped, it helped include people, and I think we are less in a precarious state in Switzerland. So people are not precarious. There are maybe some, but the system is actually working very well and very stable. But deliberation needs time. It needs independent media. People need to be trained, to understand and discuss each other and to confront each other. So this is something you cannot learn from today to tomorrow. If you have representative systems like in the EU, where you vote somebody and this guy is not doing what you want during the next 4 years, this is much more difficult than when you have direct democratic influence all the time, also when times change, and I think this is deliberation. So, and we need to go into this direction also in Europe. I mean, you do it with the European initiative, yes. Having people there discussing with each other. This is the way it works.
Yeah, but that is what I embrace. Actually, I think that referenda are rather dangerous if they're not preceded by proper deliberation. Well, Switzerland, I think you guys are quite precarious there in the way, look, there is a fear, and there is a fear in all wealthy European societies, that we're about to lose our comfortable way of life. And there is this idea of a fortress Switzerland, fortress Europe. Actually, the vote for the far right in Switzerland was among the first that started rising. Anti-immigration sentiment, although you don't have that much immigration as compared to others. So this anticipated and perceived threat to lives, livelihood, cultures, this is the experience of precarity that I think is driving that support, and it is going through the democratic channels of the referenda. Yeah. Maybe with proper deliberation you would cut that so that people can understand that the problems are elsewhere and not the immigrants who are threatening,
May I see the hands for who has questions so that okay, 1, 2, 3, yeah? Please, okay, here then? Oh, okay, here, please, yes, sorry.
Yeah, hi, I really like the talk, but I wanted to ask who is the subject of your talk? So it seems to me like we have, we're talking about the West and you have these people that are facing the erosion of their historical privileges, and this gives rise to this anxiety and this precarity that you rightly identify. Then we have immigrants within Europe that probably historically have never really had access to these privileges, former socialist countries and so on, and that are employed in the West in precarious positions, don't even have the language to identify what's happening to them, like, Romanians in like meat processing factories during COVID. And then you have immigrants from anywhere else in the world that once they make it through the enormous hurdle of European bureaucracy and visa systems, come here and, European society relies on them to even continue functioning. You need refugees that used to be, qualified like journalists and professors now acting as your Uber driver and your Lieferando delivery person, because that's the only type of jobs they will ever have access to in a European society that doesn't even welcome them. So I'm kind of just wondering, who is this talk about? Because there are some people that by the very definition of the system we live in are doomed to forever precarity, and how do we even expand this framework that we're talking about to include them as well? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, who's the subject of my analysis? I deliberately constrain myself to the analysis of the societies I know, and these are the Western societies. Now, you mentioned the most precarious. Sure, the most precarious are the immigrants who have no social protection, who have no access to social services, to employment, etc. And that reminds me, there is a stratification, and even of conflict of precarities. There is also, who is more precarious? This needs to be taken into account. So yes, we need to take that very seriously. Among the most precarious social group are the self-employed, because they're not even covered by the social protections that employees have. So that's another thing we need to take into consideration. So in a way, the language of the class struggle, capital versus labor, doesn't work anymore, because precarity cuts across that distinction.
I'm very much on your side, talking about profit and competition, and this being the one driver of our world these days. Would it be an idea to redefine profit like we are redefining GDP? Because if we do it only on this financial materialistic side, there's lots of profit left out.
Yeah.
And I think widening all this to include things that so far haven't been included in these two terms might be an idea.
Yeah, people nowadays, thank you. There's a lot of talk about replacing consideration of profit with considerations of well-being, for instance. Now, I want to, you remind me of one thing that's very often confused. I want to clarify it. You know, any economy that is run in a rational and reasonable way would produce surplus. So the production of surplus is not the problem. So, you know, we can have socialist economies produce surplus. It is, you know, think about what it means, the profit motive. If you target or plan or design your economic or cultural, etc. activity to be oriented exclusively by making profit, this is the trouble. It is not that any activity would create surplus. We need surplus in order to, you know, provide for people. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, at the end, I would like to propose a slight change of subject and ask you a question, because today Austria is voting for the lower house of parliament, and all the polls show that the ultra-right party FPÖ is going to win these elections, and you have been pointing repeatedly the interesting for me fact that lately the young people in Europe support and go and vote for the ultra-right, or for the right option, rightist, ultra-right option, whereas traditionally they were supporting progressive politics, they were caring about equality, solidarity, ecology, and so forth. So can you tell us more about your observations and probably offer an explanation?
Yes, no, that's one of the puzzles of our times. Young people in the last, for instance, the previous European elections, not now in June, but previous round, they massively voted for green parties. Usually more women voted for, you know, green and left parties. And in the most recent round, we saw equally, you know, men and women voting for the far right, and surprise, surprise, young people. So when I started looking into that, a very curious development, I saw a report specifically studying the youth in Germany. What are the concerns that young people reported? Fear of poverty in old age. So that kind of precarity exactly I'm talking about, it's anticipated and perceived loss of social status, exposure to poverty, because young people are not precarious. If you think about it, you know, apart from the 1% who are certainly not precarious, young people are not, because they still have a lot of support from home, they have, they can rely on education, so they have the means to cope right now. But they live in anticipation that they won't be able to. In that sense, they're precarious. So I hate to say I'm wrong. I'm right.
But let's hope that the Austrian youth is slightly different. And they'll make different political choices today. But now please join me in thanking Albena Azmanova for this fascinating talk.